Hello, Philip.
Hi.
Okay, so I want to do an interview with you today to bring your work to a wider audience, to people who have perhaps not heard of you. So, for some people, you're a familiar face, but for those who don't know you and who you are, who are you and what do you do?
So I'm here in Devon, and I've been here teaching at Schumacher College for the last 10 years. And during that time, a lot has changed in the world. That when I started at Schumacher College, there was a very clear kind of ecological movement. There were very clear aims to it, a very clear structure. And I was glad to be part of that, as it raised awareness, and gradually the Guardian started talking about climate change on its front page. Many of the issues that was kind of under the surface of the economy started bubbling up into people's awareness and people's conversations. And that was a very clear phase. But this last phase of the last few years has been very different. That we've had Brexit and Trump and this kind of chaotic behaviour in many systems that have stopped kind of going from A to B in a clear way, but have started being buffeted by many forces, many relationships, and become incomprehensible to many people. And in that, my work has kind of changed into seeing that what is needed has to happen more at a personal level. It's more, how do you find the coherence within yourself when everything around you is kind of blurred and fuzzy and disorientating?
So you don't see yourself as a lecturer necessarily anymore? You see yourself more as an emissary of change or something? Is that what you're getting at?
Yes. So I've moved from the classroom into projects. So doing a lot of work with water with Indian communities, and seeing what happens when you change your landscape, what happens in the hearts of people, and how if the heart of a person isn't involved, then nothing changes.
So when you say change your landscape, what kind of changes, what are you talking about?
So that's very arid landscapes in Rajasthan, and the water's getting less and less. So the water table is dropping right down and becoming unreachable to many wells. But restoring these traditional structures where you hold the water in the landscape and you involve the community so they really own the structures that you build and look after them. And in a few years, the whole area becomes green because you hold the monsoon rain, and that is able to nourish the fields and also raise the water table. So rivers that have stopped running can actually run again. And you realize that instead of passively waiting for climate change and looking for when are we going to hit the 2-degree mark, that actually everything's possible. We can change everything according to our attitude.
Great.
So it's moved from trying to kind of understand a problem in its global terms to kind of how do you motivate solutions that are there.
Well, this is something we absolutely need because we're living on a planet that has many, many problems and too few solutions, or at least solutions that actually work. And so, my interest in you and your work, and the reason for being here and interviewing you today, stems from this kind of spiritual and kind of ecological emergency we find ourselves in as a species. And we live in a world that measures nature's value in a purely economic sense. Even though it's the only thing that keeps us alive, we have no care for it at all. We're in a race to destroy it. And so we live in this disjointed, broken, completely on the wrong track kind of society, and we're deeply in need of change. And yet what we see is business as usual, but business as usual is no longer an option. Something has to change. And so do you see the world that way? And if so, why do you think human society is so broken? What's the cause of this problem?
No, I think that there are kind of two attitudes that you can have in relation to the world. One is to be open to the world, and yet to kind of surrender to something bigger than yourself and not to force things into immediate solutions, but try to open things out. So you're generous, you're trusting, you're allowing of what's around you, and you're collaborative. You're wanting to find something meaningful and integral with other people and the work you do. And alongside that, I'd say there's this kind of mean attitude. And this meanness wants to instead bring back, it wants to protect, it wants to say, this is who I am, and I'm going to hold this territory, and I want things to work in my way. And so in order for that to happen, I'm going to distrust what's outside me. I'm not going to be loyal to others. I'm going to just keep going with what is good for me and what I contend. And these two attitudes are necessary in the world. If everything was, open and loving, nothing would work, including nature. You have to have that ability to withdraw into your own gathering of energy and getting things to work.
But so okay, with this give and take kind of two attitudes that exist, it seems that the take is the one that's taken over right now.
Yeah.
We're in a world of take. Why do you think that is? Or why do you think we're in that way of doing things?
Well, I think in a way taking is simpler. It's a kind of shortcut, because you can if you say to somebody you'll be rich tomorrow, they'll believe you. If you say you'll be prosperous in 40 years and your children will be prosperous, they probably won't be patient for that. And probably I'd say that what's gradually happened is that we've taken that meanness and we've kind of turned it into a sort of metaphysics. We've turned it into a philosophy, that living for the short term, not believing in God, distrusting your neighbour, is a kind of a cool way of life, and the people who do it really coolly come out as victorious with lots of money. And so instead of having it as an attitude to life, that of course sometimes you need that kind of way, you need that way of engaging with the world. It's become as if that can be the dominant thing. You don't need anything else, that the world can run on those tracks. And now we've got to a point where it's obvious the world can't run on those tracks.
Well, I read your book, was it Time, Light, and the Dice of Creation, and in it you seem to be pointing the finger at some of the issues we have today at the kind of reductionist, scientific philosophy, which has taken over the world. Which I guess reductionist would be the opposite of holistic. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this philosophy assumes everything's separated. Everything that we understand by separating them into their own little bits. So is that right? Do you think is that the problem? Is it simply the reductionist mindset that's the cause of the problems? And if so, why is reducing things and separating them necessarily bad?
Well, I think this meanness and this openness, they go with kind of destruction and creation. That our way of, if you want to break things down to see how they work, in a way it involves killing them. You have to destroy, like you're taught in a biology class, you have to kill the amoeba, what you're studying, to see all the organs of it. And of course that is a valid way of engaging with the world, which is to try to find the mechanism behind it, and to try to take out the livingness of the world, and to see at its most elementary, how does this connect to this, and for that to work. And of course, a lot of our society runs on technology, which has happened through that method. But I think the short-sightedness is not that reductionism isn't true and isn't a way of engaging with the world, but it's eclipsing another way of engaging with the world, which is openness and you could say love, or embracing the aliveness of things, not to destroy them by putting them into parts, but to try to find their meaning, and what's their meaning in relation to a greater whole. So like Goethe, who was a scientist as well as an artist, would not take the flower into his laboratory, but he tried to, he'd meticulously look at the plant, and then he tried to, in his imagination, recreate the journey the plant was making from seed to a small form, to the different organs coming, to the flower coming out, to the seed and the plant dying and going back into the soil. So he tried to imagine that journey, and he wouldn't try to reduce back to where did this journey begin, but he tried to go forward into what is the meaning that this plant is trying to express, as if the reason for its journey was not because it was just following physical law, but the plant, the flower, the identity, the quality of the plant as a whole is what creates the journey. So the journey comes out of where it's heading to. It comes out of the future in a way. And for Goethe, there's just one gesture. You don't break that down into small bits. You don't kill that process. But with your imagination, you try and enter that process as a whole. So what is the journey that that possibility goes on in that particular context in order to express this meaning?
So would you say this is rather than cutting the flower opening, looking at the little bits and understanding it in a kind of reductionist way, the way you're describing of the flower growing and how that relates to the whole, is that what we call holism? Is that a holistic science?
Yeah. So holism has different disciplines through which it's been studied, like complexity theory, which looks at relationships and how a whole can emerge from the dynamic of relationships. So if you try and understand an organization by, which you might learn at business school, by breaking it down into, okay, we want to do this, and this person's going to do this, and that person's going to do that, then it completely rules out that this person doesn't like this person, and they're not going to work well together, and they've got a culture in this land where they're in of not working very hard anyway, so maybe it's the wrong place. So instead of trying to break things down into isolated parts, complexity is saying, what is the dynamic of relationship? And if a relationship is good, then it can have emergent qualities that are neither coming from you or from me, but are coming from the relationship of the two together. And so that's another way of looking at holism, that you cannot, in that way that reductionism has of breaking things down into isolated parts, you're actually missing some of the qualities that whole system is going to have. And Goethean science takes that a bit further, because it says it's not only the relationships that have got to be kept whole to understand the whole system, but actually it's the movement, the gesture of the plant as a whole, that if you dissect that into different stages, which you'd find in any biological textbook, you've actually lost that unity of the process as a whole.
So, okay, we're talking about holism and holistic ideas here, but I think a lot of people have heard the word holistic.
Yeah. But
it's a very vague concept for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And most people probably don't have a very solid idea really what that means.
Yeah.
So I know you're a holistic science teacher. That's one of the things you've been lecturing on, and you run the Holistic Science Journal, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there's probably no one better in the world to ask than you.
Yeah.
So what exactly is holism? What does it mean? What's the definition we're working with?
Yeah.
How do we explain it?
Yeah, it's a good question, because often holism is taken as, oh, you don't worry about the parts, you look at the whole. But that's not what holistic science is about, or Goethean science, or complexity, really. What you're interested in holism is actually looking at the relationships between the whole and the part. So there's a kind of paradox that the whole comes from the parts. You can't understand the whole message of a book unless you read each word. You can't say, oh, I'm going to understand the book, I'm not going to bother with the parts, I'm not going to read the words. You have to actually go through the parts to reach the whole. And yet at the same time, the parts would not be there. They'd not be... you would not use those parts unless they were able to express the whole in some way. So there's a kind of circle here, that you have to go through the parts to get to the whole. But what are the parts? They're expressions of the whole. And so you have to kind of suspend judgment. Like when you're reading, if you tried to isolate each part, which would be a reductionist way of analysing a book, and say, okay, this first word, it comes from Anglo-Saxon and it can mean this. That would be, you wouldn't actually understand the meaning of the book. But also, if you just flip through the whole book in 5 minutes, it wouldn't mean you'd understood the whole book either. It's called the Hermeneutic Circle, that you have to suspend judgment. You have to go into the parts, into the words, or into the flower if you're looking at it. But you're allowing that the whole that actually shapes or calls forth those parts into expressing this meaning are only there because they give expression to this whole, this quality. And so that's that thing also, having a whole process, that you can't separate that out and say, okay, this plant type has this type of parts and these connect together in this way.
So it seems what you're saying is that holistic philosophy and holistic science is not necessarily in opposition or an alternative to reductionist science. Is actually a necessary supplement that's been missing from today's scientific philosophy. Is that what you're getting?
Yeah, and very simple to expand it into that into that different focus, into that different dimension that things have.
So you've been working at Schumacher College, which is it? Would you call it a holistic university? Is that what it is? I mean, more or less. Or what is it exactly?
Well, it's a place that begun with an aspiration to provide a different type of education, and holistic science came to the college because it was understood that you can't teach wholeness in a conventional educational setting. You have to have a different address of life, where you take time, you cook together, you allow things to be in their own order, their own existence, their own quality. So it's not about filling your mind with knowledge about something. It's rather, how do you address the world? And the world has this quality of that. This isn't like a philosophy of how you can think differently. It's more being able to see how things are, and that things have this quality, that the whole and the part speak themselves into being together. So so the idea was to bring that to the college, where you're surrounded by nature, you've got space, you've got time.
So your role there has been to teach holistic science. Now, I think I certainly, and I think most people probably don't really have a good idea of what that is or what that looks like. I mean, So, when I went to school, my science studies, I did some physics and biology and chemistry. We'd, look at how atoms work and all that kind of stuff. I mean, what is holistic science? What are you actually teaching? What does that look like as a student, for example?
Well, so when you go to school and you learn about how things work, it's really important to appreciate that is one way of engaging with the world, and it's obviously a very rigorous and fair way of engaging with the world. That you start from the question, what is the material center of something? You work out its mechanism, you work out how it works, and you can employ that to a million things, to generate energy or run trains or have mobile phone technology. But what's lacking in that is that, so in that way of seeing, you're starting from a center you understand and kind of working outward into applications. But holistic science is rather trying to do the opposite thing, which is you start with a periphery of potential. And what you're asking is, how does that periphery of potential assemble itself into an identity that has meaning as a whole? And so if it does not have that meaning, it won't hold together. And really holistic science is kind of turning the mirror the other way round. That instead of asking the question, how can we understand and use this from the inside out, you can say, how does this assemble into a meaning from the outside in? And that meaning, it's not so much how things work. It kind of collects things together. It gathers qualities together into an identity that's able to exist at a higher level of things. And so when we come to the problems of the world at the moment, there's tons of things that work, but they don't hang together. Almost laughably, the actual goal is not achieved, even though you've got 100 clever things on the way which are supposed to, move that on. So the idea that somehow we've lost sight of the whole, and that there are tools, very simple tools that let you work with that, and that it's not getting rid of science, going from the center to the application, but it's saying, if you're going to make that movement, you also need to be aware of the other movement.
So I was talking to Satish, who you work with, right? He also lectures there. Yeah. So we were talking about just the modern education, the way it works, and how it seems to have derived from I think 17th century, industrialist philosophy, where kids are, grouped by date of manufacture, not how well they work in groups, for example.
Yeah.
And we all know how the modern education system works, but it seems to be deeply unhealthy. So I gather you guys are trying to work to create a healthier alternative to mainstream education. So how's that working out? Has there been positive change come through what you guys have been doing? Have you seen any students go on to change the world in some way? I mean, has it been an effective way of making things better?
Yeah, I mean, the weird thing is that you'd have thought that a lot of people would have taken notice, because the college has been going 27 years, and it's had a number of master's courses, not just holistic science. It's had short courses. It's had something like 20,000 people passing through it. And, it's a very simple model where people learn as much by living together, eating together, as the lectures. But so the first thing is, it's very strange that there hasn't really been a dialogue to say, okay, what has the college learned in relation to how mainstream teaches? Is there a way of finding a middle ground that could learn some of the lessons from the college. And it's like that instead of mainstream education having moved towards the college and have accepted the importance of the human being as an instrument to learn more than the computer or the blackboard or the textbook, it's kind of been that education has retreated, into this even more didactic and, trusting in knowledge and exams, and moved away from the individual. And so it seems, for me, what was important teaching was how you give individuals that confidence to be able to see the culture as a whole process. So, okay, we went into that industrialization, we got completely carried away with that and made it a sort of blueprint for everything, as if there was nothing else. And we are now reached this crisis. But instead of trying to sort of dismember that into and find the problem of what happened, it's to give people the confidence to address that in themselves and to say, right, what can I do that that touches that that urge, that passion in myself that believes, that wants to see whole value, that cares about the world, with this completely paradoxical systemic situation that we've created. And so for me, the success stories are the people who come to the college and who find a way of being in themselves that they can then follow, that sustains them once they leave. And it should not be a sort of utopic wholeness that immediately you leave sort of falls at the first hurdle. It should rather be a kind of generative self-reliance, that not mattering what you do, you're able to be a vehicle for something different to enter into the world.
Well, that's fantastic that you're equipping people with a tool to get through life, because life is very difficult, and I think modern education simply does not do that.
Yeah.
So and the fact that you're teaching these people a holistic perspective and a holistic way of thinking is obviously going to help them through their lives. But at the moment, those people are still in a minority. In the meantime, we live in a distinctly non-holistic society, and we're raised through the modern education system to just accept the reductionist philosophy as the only one truth, and I think when we have that, we're granted this sort of psychic alienation from the natural world, and we learn to see ourselves as separate from it, like we're on it rather than we're in it or part of it. And so we comes with that, we also start to see the world as a kind of inanimate machine, which is just here for us to exploit and for no other purpose than our own exploitative benefit. So as things are going, things don't look good for humans. Extinction is a distinct possibility right now. So for people who aren't fortunate enough to be able to go to Schumacher College, for example, or places like it, how do we get this holistic perspective back and prevent our own extinction? Do we need to become neo-Luddites and give up technology and avoid destroying the world? How do we save ourselves from here?
Yeah. Well, to me, I think it's a vital question. How do we take it beyond just one place that nobody can come to? So for me, it goes back to this question of meanness and openness. This quality of meanness and openness plays out in many different places. If you see a fairy tale like we did last night, it runs through the whole thing, and you can see it in our politics. That we've kind of as a society we've kind of endorsed this meanness. we said it's okay, like Margaret Thatcher saying, there's no such thing as society, there's just the individual. And it's like it's okay to be mean and disbelieving and not thinking about climate change and not caring. And it's that needs to be brought back into perspective, that meanness is not, you don't have a license to be mean. We can see that in the world, even if our culture says it's okay. And but there's two sides of the coin. There's also this pole of openness, where we don't try to judge. We surrender to try to meet the quality of where we are, and we're generous to the world. We're generous to each other. We're generous if we're in nature. We're generous to the opportunities there are in the world at the moment, and how we can help them. And we've kind of lost sight of that openness in order to create something together that has integrity, that has meaning, that gives direction to people. And so it's restoring that balance, where of course sometimes you have to have that meanness. You have to, not be open and generous to everything and everybody. You have to limit something into a local form. But it's for me, where we are is kind of asking this question of us, of each of us. Are we open or are we mean? Have we understood the meanness others have done to us? And can we be open in response? Can we find our destiny? What is it that's inside us to do? And I'm optimistic that everybody can do that work. You don't have to come to Schumacher College or study. It's something that a lot of people are doing at the moment, that instead of looking out there for somebody to solve our problems, it's understanding that balance of the world is in each of us. And so each of us can kind of make that equation, that weighing of these two sides, and say, okay, what do I want to do at the moment? Do I want to be mean, more mean, or is this a time to be open and to go beyond that meanness, to go beyond that anger that this has happened and that has happened and that has happened, and to say, oh, I believe in something in the world.
So this meanness that seems to be around in the world, and you're encouraging a change here, which is great, and trying to get people to think in a more generous and open way. This is great, but this meanness is pervasive at the moment, and I wonder whether it's linked to the kind of reductionist philosophy in some way. The idea that we're all separate individuals, rather than for example, Satish was talking about how with the holistic philosophy, if you think of chopping a tree, you also have to think that you're chopping off your own arm, because every time you chop down that tree, it does affect you, and it affects everyone and everyone else. And this when we see ourselves as so separate, we can hurt the world around us without assuming that we're also getting hurt, or that we're hurting those we love. So I wonder whether this reductionist philosophy is perhaps the cause of some of the meanness that you talk about. What do you think?
Well, I think originally reductionism, it was a verb, that it was possible to separate something from the world. So Maxwell said that the way to study something is to isolate it from everything around it. So if you want to study the tree, you have to isolate it. You can't see it as your arm. If you want to do an analysis for an encyclopedia article of what that tree is, the whole point of science is to separate. But as long as you see it as a verb, that it's something that we do, that separating, then it's balanced. There's a complementary, that putting together is also a verb, and that you have to have both those verbs, otherwise the world becomes like a Tower of Babel, that it's incomprehensible. And so to reduce is fine, because that's how our brain works too. Our brain has to think of the tree as something separate to one's arm. That's how we think. But reductionism as a kind of that becomes made into something that's taught as if it's the cultural norm, and it's made to apply to everything. That if you don't fit in a box at the moment, you're liable to be arrested. I mean, almost literally. That the whole health and safety, the whole classification of things, is to actually work with a world that's completely separated, that's completely reduced, not as a way of understanding the world, as a verb to reduce, but as something that's taken completely literally, that the world actually, its only existence is in that categorized and reduced state, and that the only way for it to work is by putting everything into some box or other.
So it's not that we can point the finger at the reductionist philosophy as being the problem, it's the reductionist philosophy without its complementary holistic philosophy that's the problem. It's the reductionist philosophy alone, in isolation, that's the problem.
Yeah.
So right now, we live in this world where the reductionist philosophy alone is the main way of the prominent way of thinking. People don't really consider holistic attitudes alongside the reductionist side. So it's like we're walking on one leg, and while we're doing that, we've gone off. Maybe in the past few hundred years, it seems to gone off track completely, and we're just absolutely destroying the planet and our own life support systems. We're just wrecking it. And meanwhile, we've got these indigenous societies, the last of them, who don't share this same way of thinking. They think much more holistically, I gather, at least.
Yeah.
And they've been living sustainably for thousands of years, and now the last of them are pleading with us, please don't destroy what little is left. And so something is clearly wrong with the way people are thinking. So I gather it seems that it's the lack of holistic thinking being integrated with reductionist thinking. So when did this happen, and why did it happen? Like, why and when did we adopt this only kind of reductionist view set? Was it Descartes, or when did this happen? Why did it happen? And how is it different before then, perhaps?
Yeah. So the focus on after what happened really was there was there was the story of Catholicism, which was a single story, and then Protestantism came along in the West, and suddenly you had many stories, and then there was the 30 Years' War, and the whole idea of having the spirit or God as a kind of a leading a leading figure of how to live in the world, kind of you could say at that point we were in the opposite state of trusting too much in a holistic view, with no kind of breaks or resistance to whoever was in power in that way. And what's incredible, though, is that the scientific revolution happened in an incredible short time. That change of ideas from believing in the priest or God unquestionably to the idea that science could provide an understanding that was everybody's about how the world worked, and that it did not require a priesthood. Anybody could do the experiments. Rationality became a kind of a whole body of knowledge that could have courts, it could have experiments, it could look into the nature of things. And it was within about 30 years, around the time of Newton, and at the end of the 30 Years' War, where the Catholics and the Protestants in Europe had spent, battle after battle in this pointless, who was representing the true God. And so there is something very hopeful in that change can happen really quickly when a culture gets satiated with a particular way of being. And you can say that that up till around 1850, science developed quite kind of openly. That there was no big industry. It was mainly rich people who were doing it. There was a dialogue, like Goethe was able to practice science, not being part of the academia, and challenge science. I think, though, that around 1850, especially when Darwinism, the origin of species, and Maxwell invented electromagnetism, so that brought in mobile phones, the steam engine came, and then at that point, that whole way of intellectualization started being kind of allied to a whole system of industrialization, and with power and money at stake. And so it became much more it became much more something that it became a sort of philosophy in itself, this way of thinking, instead of just a way to act. And if you look how that went further, like with the atom bomb in the 1920s, where it ended up that our intellectualization could destroy the world, and we started psychoanalyzing people, and everything became intellectual. So it's sort of been like an onion, that we've been going into this thing, and we've now reached this kind of, the nucleus, you could say, where nothing works. Despite that huge effort, we've got to a place of complete inner incomprehensibility, and really like a breakdown, that we can't even talk properly to each other without some concept ending up bringing a divide between people. So we can't kind of solve what's happened. We can't say, let's do this to education, it'll be all right. Let's start a school here, it'll be all right. It's rather we've got to accept that we've been on this journey, and we've pushed something right to the limit of saying, okay, there's no God, meanness is fine. We can just survive on our own intelligence.
Well, your book, Time, Light and the Desecration, it goes into quite a lot of detail about this kind of fascinating and mind-boggling world of quantum physics.
Yeah.
And I think quantum physics is another one of those things that most people only have a very vague understanding of and don't really understand. I mean, I've heard the terms, but I don't really understand them. Terms like quantum entanglement and the double split experiments.
Yeah.
Now, these are fascinating things, but I've even tried to research them and I still don't really understand them. But you do seem to understand these things a lot better than most people. So can you kind of explain them in a way that we can understand? Like, what is this quantum entanglement and the double split experiment? And, what's going on with all this stuff?
Well, the double slit experiment is that you have a particle and you have two slits. So you have a slit here and a slit here, and this is covered in the middle. And so the particle can go through two slits. And so normally, if you cover one of the slits, you'd expect the particle to go through one slit or the other. So it would go through the slit, and because the slit has a certain breadth, it will appear on the screen behind it over a very small band. So if you cover one slit, it appears here. If you cover the other slit, it appears here. So you think that if you had both slits open, that you would get a band here and a band here and nothing in between. But actually, if you have both slits open, you get a completely different result over many experiments. That you get a sort of interference pattern where the most ways that the particle goes through the slit is at the center. It's not directly through one slit, or it's directly through another. And some particles then go to the side of that, and a small number then go further out. So you get a completely different result if both slits are open than if you add what happens if one slit is open and the other slit is open. What is more remarkable is if you now look at one slit, so you look through which slit the particle is going through, that will change the result of the experiment, and you'll go back to having a band here and a band here of where the particle hits the screen. So how you observe, where you measure the system, actually changes the result of the system. So this completely overturns that whole Newtonian idea that reductionism is able to give you a picture of the world independent of the observer.
So, I mean, this is mind-boggling. Why does that happen? Do we have an idea of why looking at the slit to see which hole it goes through, how that changes the pattern when it hits the wall? I mean, do we know why this happens? Is it a mystery to us at the moment?
Yeah, it's a complete mystery, and you can't. You can't. You have to bring in something about measurement, but you can't. It's not a sort of fabrication because we haven't understood enough to get what really is going on. But to give an example of Henry Bortoft, who worked with David Bohm and who provided a holistic interpretation of this, that he would have said that the world is not reductionist. You can't just take it apart, and that there's an objective world out there which you've explained once you've taken it apart. Somehow there's something else happening where the way we interact with the world, with the meaning we make with the world, has something to do with how the world is constituted. You can't separate out an objective world and put the observer somewhere else and say, let's reduce this world into its parts and then we'll see how it works. Instead, you have to say that when you observe something, in a sense, you're bringing it into being. And that you can bring things into being in different ways. And so this goes back to what we were saying about you can bring the world into being in a mean way or an open way. That there is no world out there that's already formed. It's how you relate to the world helps create the world that you live in through the choice you've made.
This is a difficult kind of what's the word, intangible concept. It's quite difficult to get my head around this. So you're saying there's no actual, or we don't actually perceive the objective world. There is no objective world. It's a world that we're creating in our own heads. I mean, what do you mean when you're talking about this?
Yeah. So the assumption of reductionism is that that there's a world out there, and that we interact with that world, and we can explain what that world is by science and experiment. But there's an assumption in there that this world out there exists, and that assumption is what quantum theory brings into question, because according to how you interact as the observer with the system, the system behaves differently. So you need some other way of, you need some other context in which the world is behaving that is more than just the material parts of it. So something is happening. There's some kind of connection between the observer and the apparatus of the slits and the particle that is more than just the particle, the slits, and the screen on which you're measuring it. And so, one thing you're not looking at is holism. You're not looking at the idea of what is that context of meaning in which all these different things relate: the particle, the slits, the observer. And so when you bring in this context of meaning, then and you say that it's actually, you need a context of meaning for something to exist. And so what the experiment is showing is that is in a way the particle and the slits and the observer finding that context of meaning in which they coexist. And having found that context of meaning, only then is there an objective world which you can talk about the particle as something separate, the slits as something separate, the screen as something separate.
I see. So this philosophy of taking in holism into account is not normal. Unfortunately, most people don't think that way.
Yeah.
So right now we generally in a society share this kind of reductionist worldview only. We take that perspective, and I'd really like to see human society kind of upgrade that or move on from it or reincorporate holism in some way, because this current philosophy that has just the universe as a machine and there's nothing animate in it and there's nothing connected seems not only to be just flawed and wrong, but it also seems to be what permits us just to do this wholesale destruction of the world. So this reductionist model is founded on the belief, though, that we live in this kind of mechanical universe that exists according to realizable and inviolable laws. But quantum physics seems to show that that's not actually how the universe works. There's something else going on. The mechanical worldview doesn't seem to hold up in the face of quantum physics, right? And yet, orthodox science still holds just the reductionist worldview largely. So why hasn't science kind of changed to adopt holism to explain this quantum physics? How can scientists say the world is this mechanical place while also knowing that quantum physics exists? Why is it like that? What's going on?
Well, there's a really tale which is in my book about so when Bohr and Heisenberg and other physicists kind of tried to come to struggle with what is the meaning of quantum physics, and they went through years because they were schooled in a mechanical way, and they just could not come to terms with results like the double slit experiment. And it took until the 1925 and 26 to realize that you couldn't talk anymore of a world out there, that physics was about understanding the world. You had to talk about, physics was about the questions you could ask of the world and the type of answers the world gave back, which was a huge shift. But in order to dress this up into something that was acceptable, they introduced this idea of measurement as a philosophical cloak in which to dress up the theory. And because when you actually measure something, these mysterious effects kind of collapse, because you're actually seeing something, you're forcing something into existence, you're imposing a meaning at which the weirdness dissipates. By bringing measurement in, it was a way of getting back to something that was at least vaguely tangible in physical terms, that it had to do with isolated particles and isolated existences. And after they'd come to this understanding in the 1920s, they, in the 1930s, they understood, they were investigating the atom and the nucleus. And they realized that there was a particle called the neutron, which was neutral in the nucleus. And in 1938, just as the Second World War was starting, they realized that you could actually, by hitting an atom with a neutron traveling at high speed, you could split a nucleus into two different elements. And there were certain elements which, by complete chance, apparently, seemed to allow this to happen. And not only when you split one nucleus apart, a neutron would come out, or two neutrons would come out, which could then split two more nucleuses, and then produce four neutrons, which could then split eight. And so, right at the beginning of the war, when that whole meanness of spirit was opening up this conflict, in man's hands was this, he realized he had this weapon. And so it was very analogous to what was happening politically, that he knew how to destroy the world at the very time in which his hatred was creating this very context in which such a weapon could be used. And there was this incredible meeting in 1941 where Heisenberg, who was German, and Germany were occupying Denmark, he went to visit Bohr in Copenhagen, who'd been his boss. And Bohr he was Jewish, so he was completely surprised why Heisenberg, in these circumstances, would come and visit him. And Heisenberg, in his letter, said he was vaguely, because they were working on the German bomb, he knew Bohr was working on the Danish bomb. And they met under very recriminating circumstances. There was no common ground between them. And it was like the two men split from the one holding the Jewish side of things, the Allied side of things, and Heisenberg holding the German side of things and the occupier side of things. And so it was like that whole division played out, that whole destruction that was on the table of mankind in the conversation between the two people. And because there was no wholeness, because they could not find in their theory there was no wholeness, there was no way for them to come together in a humanitarian kind of step. So it's quite chilling, and that incredibly the war ended August the 8th when the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And so the whole war you can see in terms of this analogy of reductionism and losing the whole. And so and it's amazing how that there's this language kind of running through our culture that it somehow speaks the greater possibility of our culture. So how the atom became this symbol for destruction, and yet somehow I would say that within the atom you can look at it differently. You can have a holistic viewpoint of it. You can look at the atom in terms of meaning, and instead of breaking it apart and destroying that meaning, you can celebrate meaning in the atom. You can say the atom is like something through which meaning comes. You can turn around quantum theory to say the universe is where the observer creates the world as one with meaning in his engagement with the world. So I'd say, both possibilities are there through quantum physics.
But is that what we see in the world right now? Is modern science changing and becoming more holistic in order to understand the entire universe, including quantum physics? Are we seeing change there and a return to holistic thinking, or no? What do you think?
Well, part of my work at the moment, which you asked at the beginning, is trying to say, how can you, and it's not just mine, it's been a lot of people, how can you bring a language of wholeness back into physics? And I would say that that journey has taken huge strides, like with Henry Borthoff, Spencer Brown, who wrote a logic of wholeness, Basil Hiley, who applied it into modern physics. And I think there is a step to be taken that would bring this double dimension to reality, the wholeness and the reductionism, back into science. It's not that it's like science is only seeing with one eye or only standing on one leg, but both legs or both eyes are there in the picture, especially with quantum theory. So in that sense, I'm very hopeful in one way that that move is sort of imminent. But on the other hand, our whole belief system has been based on reductionism. And so you can't just argue, let's get rid of our belief system in a paper. Somehow the whole and the part have got to change at the same time, that our view of the world we're in and the belief that governs how we behave in that world, they've got to change simultaneously. So we accept, just like they did at the time of Newton, where in writing Principia Mathematica, he both changed the understanding that underpinned the culture, but at the same time he changed the belief.
Well, right now we're at a time that's ripe for this change, and it's being brought on by an emergency of the climate, and this kind of fractured existence we have, where everything's split up, has led to just a seeming nightmare that's coming in terms of the environment. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Exeter, and I saw hanging on various monuments around town and clock towers and stuff these big banners. And it was like when you watch a post-apocalyptic movie, you see signs from before the movie saying it's time, we have to change, the last of days are upon us. And it was those kind of banners. They were put out by a group called the Extinction Rebellion, and I never heard of them before. And basically they were saying, time is running out, we have to change. And I like this message, the Extinction Rebellion, because that's really what we're facing. Maybe not in the next decade. Could be in the next decade, it could be 100 years, could be 200 years, but the way things are going, it's completely unsustainable and it has to change. So it's clear that holistic thinking, bringing back ecology and economy and science and theology and bringing these back together is very important. It will be a great medicine for this current era we're in. But even if it's adopted worldwide and everything does change and we start thinking more holistically, we might, for example, consider the ecological impact of our economic decisions. We might decide not to stop chopping down the rainforest, but we still have this kind of the relentless operation of this exponential growth curve, not just with population growth, but with everything that comes with that. And that exponential growth curve, acts as a kind of multiplier for every issue we face. So we're at this precipice now. We're at on the edge of an emergency, and our leaders, our political leaders, are absolutely going to do nothing to save us. They're in on the game. If anything, they're bringing us closer to the edge. So what can we do now to prevent this, to change things, prevent our own extinction as a species, to stop things collapsing? Can we even do that? Are we even redeemable? Are we going to make it? How do we find this way forward into a healthier future? Okay, if it's even possible. What do you think?
Yeah. No. So to go back to the work in India, which is with very dry areas and where the water is decreasing, at least in the last couple of years, then it's quite incredible when you see what happens when a community actually takes on board openness, that they become open to the land, they become open to each other, they become open to the possibilities. And at that moment that they commit, they sing together, we're going to return the water, we're going to put money into returning the water, we're going to help do it. And what happens then is that this huge activity happens where the community come in their tractors and start moving the earth, after they've chosen a site to do it. Every day, huge, it's just this turnaround of tractors, and the JCBs putting the mud into the tractors, and they're building the walls. And if you tried to do that top down, if you tried to get some world leader to tell you, right, we're going to build this Johad, it could take 5 years and probably would never get completed. But because the villagers have decided to do it in their heart, then it takes 10 days maybe. And then they create the walls of it, they create the overflow structure. It's well thought through, and it has to be durable because all this water's pouring through it. So they add bricks. But at the end of it, that landscape is completely changed. There are green fields, they're growing wheat where they weren't before. And you see this huge lake of water that was completely dry. All the monsoon rain would just wash away before that. And so if you see that, then you realize that if people in their heart can encompass this openness in our current situation, can reach to that source in themselves, then everything can change really quickly. It's not that change has to come from outside. We need a law, we need to get rid of economic growth, we need to somehow dismantle reductionism. It's that you have to get people into the feel of what an emergency is and what an emergency requires from us, and that that what comes from our heart in our openness to other people and the landscape and what's possible at this time is what the world needs and nothing else. And so we've got to follow that. And if we do, then things can happen incredibly quickly. Like if there's a disaster somewhere, that speed at which relief is made.
So you're talking somewhat about this kind of openness, this generous spirit. What I'm interested in here is a kind of a solid way. How do we do this? Now, I kind of softly understand what you mean. Try and become a bit more giving and a bit less taking, and a bit less caring about my own thing and more caring about the greater world, perhaps. But as a kind of final message to people out there, how do we do this? How do we become more open and more generous and more giving and better, and how do we really bring that into ourselves?
Yeah, so the analogy of the water is a good one. How do you bring water to an arid desert? So we've created this arid desert of the spirit in our culture, but we shouldn't worry. We could spend our whole time worrying about it, and so do many communities in India. The first thing is to say, okay, this has happened. The rain has stopped, the wells are dry, we've got a dry land. But the point is not to stop there. It's not to think that's an excuse not to do anything. The second thing is to say, okay, we're in this situation. How can it be a challenge? How can this threat or this challenge we've laid down to the spirit by the attitude we've taken, how can we still bring the spirit back into the world? How can we still make something beautiful happen? And so it's being able, it's not ignoring what's happening in some idealistic way. It's taking what's happening face on and seeing the process of it, the movement of it that we've been through. And where are we in this movement? We're at a critical point where everything is fragmenting, and we're at that point where everything's going to crash, or something beautiful and whole is going to be created that can be a vessel for the spirit, just like in the desert you build a vessel for the water. And so I think that in the end that is the movement we're going to make, because we can't make any other movement.
We're going to make it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you very much.